Hello, everyone. So last time we were starting to talk about the cortex, about the cerebral cortex. So we're going to start off with that. So as I mentioned before, the cortex is the outer part of the brain, and there really is a great deal of function associated with the cortex all around. And so the cortex is actually going to be divided into different areas. So you have some areas of the cortex that are associated with motor function. And typically what we're dealing with is voluntary motor activity out in these so-called areas of the cortex. Similarly, we have sensory areas, which are going to be associated with the conscious awareness of sensation. Okay, so this is not really dealing with the actual mechanistic feeling of a sensation. Sensory areas are dealing with really the conscious awareness and the conscious interpretation of senses. Then we have association areas, and the association areas are really diverse. We have all kinds of association areas. I am going to mention a couple of them, but by no means are we going to go through every single association area, just because there are so many of them, and really what they are considered integrative areas. These are areas that are going to integrate all kinds of different information together. And so again, we'll just mention a few of those because there are some really important ones that you should know about. Regarding the cortex, we have opposite control, okay? So, and you've all heard this, and I think I've mentioned it before, that we have contralateral control, okay? So what that means is the right side of the cortex controls the left side of the body and vice versa, okay? So we have this sort of contralateral control. Lateralization or specialization of cortical function. So what this is referring to is that, for example, the right side of the brain or the right cortex has special functions that are different from the left side, all right, and vice versa. But all in all, you should know that the entire cortex, all of it, is going to be responsible for conscious behavior, and a great deal of the cortex is going to be working at the same time to do this function of conscious, of controlling behavior, of interpreting how to respond to a certain thing, and that kind of stuff. So this picture is outlining some of these areas, right? We have motor areas, we have sensory areas, and we have association areas. And so, of course, you don't need to know all of this. I'm just picking out the ones that I feel you really need to know about. Okay, and we're going to go through some of these individually. All right, so so for example, Wernicke's area. This is considered part of an association area, and so this Wernicke's area we'll talk about, and that is outlined here in these dashed lines. Similar to that, we have another association area called Broca's area, and this is also outlined here. Broca's area is very important. We'll talk about that association area. And a couple of these other ones we'll mention, okay? But don't try to memorize all that. Okay, so in the cortex for motor function, a little more detail about this. So we have what's known as the primary motor cortex, or you can call it the somatic motor cortex. Most people call it the primary motor cortex. And this really is inside of another region we already talked about, and that is the precentral gyrus. So remember, the precentral gyrus, which is just anterior to the central sulcus, this is associated with voluntary control of motor activity. So specifically, this region is the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is inside of the precentral gyrus, okay? And this is specifically the part of the precentral gyrus that is going to be associated with voluntary motor control. Now we have a certain type of cell that is going to be existing here in this primary motor cortex. And these get a lot of attention. These are studied pretty often. They're called pyramidal cells, and they're a little bit different from other neurons. They're pretty large, but these have special function. They are the specific cell type. It's the specific kind of neuron that you're going to find located here in the primary motor cortex. And these cells are going to be associated with really providing the command for what's going to happen here in the precentral gyrus, and sending out what output is needed to do precise, planned, skilled motor functions. So these pyramidal cells make up a tract system called the pyramidal corticospinal tract system. And so remember that a tract system in the brain is a collection of axons, right? So we're having this specific tract system, which is specifically going to come from, it's going to originate in here in the primary motor cortex, and then it's going to traverse all the way down to the spinal cord, and these will end up connecting with motor neurons of the spinal cord to cause movement. Okay, corticospinal. Cortico meaning that the tract system begins in the cortex, spinal that it ends at the spinal cord. Okay, so corticospinal. Now, something known as somatotopy, there's actually a map in this primary motor cortex of the precentral gyrus of all the muscles in the body. There's actually, you can map out every single part, every single muscle group of the body to be existing in specific parts of the precentral gyrus. So it's kind of interesting. So let's take a look at that. This is also called, when we're talking about motor function, we also call this the motor homunculus, okay, or motor homunculi. All right, now let's just take a look at that. All right, so here what we're looking at is the primary motor cortex, which again, we can really just say it's part of the precentral gyrus. And what we have here is a mapping out of, basically in the primary motor cortex, there are specific parts of it that are associated with specific muscles going to specific parts of the body. All right, and it does have this mapping out here. All right, so the toes, okay, the ankle, the knee, right, the trunk, the shoulder, muscles of the shoulder, muscles of the elbow, and it's all mapped out perfectly, okay, like this. So specific parts of the primary motor cortex are going to be involved in controlling or initiating movement of muscles in these specific parts. Okay, don't memorize this map, but just know that we do have this very high level of specificity in this primary motor cortex, where we can control very specific parts of the body for movement. Okay, so now with motor function, we can go a little bit more towards the frontal lobe and see higher level control of motor function. Okay, so I already mentioned the primary motor cortex. Remember, the primary motor cortex is inside the precentral gyrus. Now, just anterior to the precentral gyrus, you find this area called the premotor cortex. Premotor, because it's before the primary motor cortex, okay? Premotor cortex is anterior to the precentral gyrus. And this is really the planning area. This is really where we're having conscious, remember, we're in the cortex here. We're about conscious control in the cortex. So we're really doing all of our planning for movement and skilled motor activity. Anything that we've learned about whatever motor functions have been learned are going to be integrated here, and sort of a command is going to be created here in the premotor cortex. So once a plan for movement for a voluntary action has been decided on, then that information will then go to the primary motor cortex, and then we have our muscle action. Broca's area. So Broca's area, I mentioned, a really important area that you should definitely know. I'm sure you'll be asked about that one. Broca's area is a special motor association area. You should definitely know that this Broca's area is, it says here, it's usually on the left side of the brain. Okay, it's usually in the left hemisphere, the cortex of the left hemisphere. Now, sometimes this may be on the right side of the brain in some people, but the majority of people, this area is going to be on the left. Okay, and you should definitely know this. And that's going to relate to a conversation we're going to have about stroke here in a minute. So what is the function of this area? For sure, you should know that the function of the Broca's area is speech production. Okay, so this area of the cortex is going to be associated with muscles, okay, directing muscles of the mouth, the tongue, okay, the throat area, all of the muscles associated with producing words, okay? This Broca's area is very specific to this function, speech production. And remember, it's on the left side of the brain. Another little area here just to mention that's also in the frontal lobe, in the cortex of the frontal lobe, is something called the frontal eye field. And this is going to control voluntary eye movements. And that's all I'm really going to say about that area. All right, so stroke, all right? I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about stroke because most of you will see this at some point in your life if you have not already. Maybe some of you have family members that have experienced stroke. It's really not that uncommon, unfortunately. So what is a stroke? Well, a stroke is kind of like the heart attack of the brain. Okay, it's kind of similar in pathology. Okay, in terms of what causes this. All right. Well, we're going to have some blockage. Okay, it's usually going to be some sort of a blood clot that develops in a very specific network of vessels, of blood vessels in the brain. And I want to go ahead and tell you, I don't have this on a slide. This maybe will be a bonus question sometime. I don't know. The most common artery to be affected here in stroke is it's called the MCA, the middle cerebral artery. And the middle cerebral artery is the one that's most commonly the cause, okay, of a stroke. All right, you're going to have a blood clot in the middle cerebral artery. Now, your carotid artery, okay, is going to be bringing blood up through this network of blood vessels that contain the middle cerebral artery. Okay, so we're going to get a blood clot here in this middle cerebral artery, and the location of this network of nerves, and specifically of the middle cerebral artery, well, the middle cerebral artery supplies Broca's area. Okay, it supplies the Broca's area. It also supplies other parts. It supplies part of the frontal lobe, and depending on how severe the blood clot is, you can start to see effects in other parts of the brain, like in the parietal regions and the temporal regions. It really depends on how severe the stroke was. But most often, what you're going to see in any stroke patient is you're going to see effects in the Broca's area because it is very close to the middle cerebral artery. So what do you see then? All right, a person has a stroke. What are you going to see? Well, Broca's area is not getting blood supply, so it's not working, okay? And eventually it's going to die. It's going to undergo necrosis. So that means the person is not able to produce words. Okay, so this is why when a person has a stroke, they're not talking, right? They're not producing speech. They're not able to do this. Okay, so I want you to also note that remember where the Broca's area is. The Broca's area is on the left side of the brain, okay? And like 99 point something percent of people, it is on the left side of the brain. So what this means is, remember, we have contralateral control. So if you have an injury on the left side of the brain, it's the right side of the body that's going to be affected. So if we have the left side of the brain affected in stroke, you're going to see issues on the right side of the body. So in a stroke victim, you may see paralysis, especially, okay, you're especially in the face, okay, the upper parts of the body, the face, the neck. So you will see a paralysis on the right side of the face, maybe the neck. And if the stroke is a little more severe, you may see paralysis in the right arm, okay, the right arm. If it's very severe, they might even have paralysis in the right leg, okay? So definitely want to understand that. Okay, you're going to have a problem producing speech. You're going to have paralysis on the opposite side of the body, so on the right side. Excuse me. Okay, so, you know, the issue here is this is why, you know, we want to take someone to physical therapy, all right? You want to try to activate, stimulate the neurons to sort of regain control, okay? Now, after a period of time of physical therapy, what you might see in this person is that you will see what's called compensation. And you will start to see the right side of the brain, the motor part of the right side of the brain, trying to pick up activity and sort of take over the function of Broca's area. And so this is why you will actually see, if you really do a lot of physical therapy with the person, and if the stroke was mild, okay, then you may see some recovery of function, as it says down here. Also, some of these the neurons in the premotor cortex can be reprogrammed to take over to compensate for the loss of function in the surrounding neurons, okay? I mentioned that the Broca's area is going to be damaged, but keep in mind also, the middle cerebral artery does not just supply the Broca's area. The middle cerebral artery is also going to be supplying parts of the frontal lobe, okay? So our premotor area, all right, is going to be affected as well, all right? So with practice, though, okay, if you can try to encourage the person to talk, and this is why speech therapists, speech pathologists will work with stroke victims as well, to try and sort of get this Broca's area to start working again, or to at least try to encourage some sort of compensation by maybe another surrounding area to help, you know, try and get that speech back, okay? It is possible. Again, it depends on the severity of the stroke. If it's a mild stroke, chances are pretty good that you can, through physical therapy and speech therapy, get this person to experience either a reprogramming of surrounding neurons or, you know, sort of a compensation of function in other areas close by. All right, so also something to keep in mind now with stroke. The person is not able to produce speech initially, but really important that you keep in mind, you know, as someone who will be dealing with people, you know, and you come across someone who has a stroke, keep in mind that this person, although they're not able to produce speech, they understand. They're able to comprehend speech. So just because they can't communicate with you verbally doesn't mean they can't understand you. All right, so please keep that in mind. They are totally aware. And it's actually really, really sad when you think about it, that a person with stroke, they understand everything that's going on around them. Okay, their cognition has not been diminished. All right, they understand everything. They hear everything you say, all of that. Okay, so keep that in mind. It must be really frustrating for them, you know, to be able to hear what's going on, but they're not able to communicate. They're not able to respond to you like they used to. So be sensitive to that kind of a thing. All right. Okay, so that's stroke. All right, so other areas, just like motor areas, we do have sensory areas in the cortex. And like I said, these are going to be associated with conscious awareness of sensation. And, as I mentioned, as far as the areas go, we call these association areas, or I'm sorry, I should say that differently. We have sensory areas, but we also have association areas. So we have sensory association areas, and it really gets complex. And, I just listed down here some of the association areas associated with sensation. And, just so as you can see, you're going to have an area, you're also going to have an association area associated with every single modality of sensation. All right, so you're going to have areas as well as association areas associated with vision, with audition, auditory, vestibular, okay, so balance, hearing, smell, gustatory. Gustatory is referring to taste, visceral sensations, so coming from organs, somatosensory, so coming from the body, all right, from muscles and that kind of thing. So, of course, we just do not have the time to go into anything really about these specific areas, okay? But you should know they're there, and this should give you some appreciation for the complexity going on here in the cortex. All right, here's just the brain again, and it's color-coded, so, we're able to sort of see some of these important areas. We've got our primary motor cortex here, which remember is located in the precentral gyrus. Just like we have a primary motor cortex in there, we also have a primary somatosensory cortex located in the postcentral gyrus. Remember, this is dealing with sensation, okay? A lot of your motor function is going to be just anterior to your precentral gyrus, okay? So we have our premotor cortex here. A lot of people call this the motor association area. Remember the Broca's area, okay? So the Broca's area affected in stroke. And again, our middle cerebral artery is coming up right here, okay? Middle cerebral artery, which is receiving blood from the carotid artery, which traverses up the neck, is coming up. That carotid artery is coming up like this way, and it's feeding into the middle cerebral artery, which will be under the brain in the middle here. Well, it's medial, but it's also a little bit anterior. So that middle cerebral artery directly supplies the Broca's area, which is why in stroke, this is the area we're definitely going to be seeing affected. But also, that middle cerebral area does supply other areas nearby that Broca's area, okay, like this motor association area, all right? Okay, just anterior to the motor cortex here, we have our prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk a little bit about that. What else to be seen here? Not really going into these other areas. Wernicke's area. Okay, Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is sort of the counterpart to Broca's area. Wernicke's area is associated with speech comprehension. Remember, Broca's deals with speech production. Wernicke's deals with speech comprehension. Okay, so again, remember, a person who's had a stroke, where are we affected? Here at the Broca's. Okay, most people who have had a stroke, who have a mild to moderate stroke, still have their Wernicke's area intact, meaning they understand. Okay, now if it's a real severe stroke, meaning that we're actually affecting other arteries in addition to the middle cerebral artery, then you will start to see problems in other areas, okay? But again, that's going to be like with severe stroke. And yeah, that's good for that. Here's just an anatomy, all right? A mid-sagittal view here. You can still see some of these parts here from this view. That's all. So primary somatosensory cortex, remember I just mentioned that as being the specific part of the postcentral gyrus, okay, that you find in the parietal lobe, which is associated with receiving all incoming sensory information, okay, including proprioceptors. Remember, proprioceptors found in skeletal muscle, joints, tendons. Proprioceptors are associated with giving us the ability to know where we are in space. It is considered a sensory receptor. Okay, so not just proprioceptors, but all of our sensory receptors out in the body are going to send information that will eventually terminate or synapse here in the primary somatosensory cortex of the postcentral gyrus. Now, remember we mentioned the homunculus. Remember we had a motor homunculus, okay, part of somatotopy where we were able to map out different parts of the body onto the primary motor cortex. Well, the same thing applies to the postcentral gyrus. The same thing. We also have a somatosensory homunculus where in this postcentral gyrus you can actually specify specific parts of this postcentral gyrus with specific parts of the body where sensation coming from those specific parts of the body will synapse in those exact parts to represent those exact parts of the body. Okay, so again, just indicating to you the level of specificity going on here in the cortex. Okay. And we will have some integration going on here in this area called the somatosensory association cortex. So outside of the postcentral gyrus, we have this association area, and it's called the somatosensory. And remember, when we say association area, we're talking about a part of the cortex that's doing integration. It's integrating all sorts of input into a finalized product of understanding. So again, here it's no different with any other association area. With sensation, somatosensory association area is going to allow you to put everything together, to put all that sensory input together and form one final understanding of a sensation. All right, you do have for vision, you have a primary visual cortex. This is located in the occipital lobe, and we're going to be receiving information from the retina here. Just like with every other modality of sense, you have an association area, okay? I'm really not concerned that you know the specifics about the visual association area, but this is here if you want to look at it. It's just that in general, any of your association areas, no matter what they are, no matter what sense they're associated with, are going to be doing integration. They're going to be integrating experience, memory, the ability to recognize, something you've seen before, and eventually you will form, based on the integration in these association areas, you will form some final understanding of whatever that sensation was. Okay, again, auditory areas, okay, just like you have a primary motor cortex, you have a primary visual area, you also have a primary auditory cortex. Now, auditory, we're dealing with the temporal lobes. This is in the temporal lobes. And what we're going to do is interpret information from the inner ear, such as pitch, loudness, and a location of where that object is. We're going to be interpreting that kind of information in this primary auditory cortex. Just like all of the other major areas, we have an association area associated with it. And again, remember, association just means we're doing a little bit higher level processing of that sensory modality. Vestibular cortex, again, okay, same thing. This is going to be dealing, remember, cortex, we're talking about conscious awareness, no matter where, okay? And this is going to have to do with balance, okay? How are you positioned in space? And again, these all just speak for themselves. Olfactory cortex, you also have a primary olfactory cortex involved in the awareness of odors, gustatory dealing with taste, visceral dealing with sensations associated with organs. So again, here's your precentral gyrus, and then your postcentral gyrus just behind that. So just like we had a motor homunculus, we also have a sensory homunculus, all right, located in the primary somatosensory cortex of the postcentral gyrus. All right, and again, you're going to just have these different parts of the body specifically laid out in specific parts of this cortex. All right, here's this homunculus again. All right, we have a motor map on the precentral gyrus. We also have a sensory map on the postcentral gyrus. Just a quick mention here that damage to the primary visual cortex is what can cause blindness, right? Functional blindness can be caused by taking out this primary visual cortex. You will not be able to process whatever visual stimuli. Okay, and kind of interesting. If you have a damaged visual association area, you can still see. Okay, what this does is demonstrate to you the difference between a primary area and an association area. So the primary visual cortex, if that's damaged, you will not be able to see, because that is the primary area that's dealing with inputs coming from visual sensation. However, the association areas are dealing with higher level processing of a sensation, not the receiving of a sensation itself. Okay. It deals with integrating, bringing information from other parts of the brain so you can have a whole picture, you can have a whole finalized, final understanding of it. Okay, so if your association area is intact, I'm sorry, let me re-say that. If your association area is damaged, yet your primary visual cortex is still intact, you're still able to see, okay, because you still have this primary visual cortex. But if your association area isn't working, you don't understand what you're looking at. You're not able to integrate any information from your past or anything else about what it is you're seeing, so you don't understand it. All right, so you can see just fine, but you don't get it. You don't understand what you're looking at. Okay, so this just demonstrates the difference between like a primary area of the cortex, difference between that and like an association area. Alrighty. So the frontal lobe, we're in the frontal lobe here. I mentioned the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is also called the anterior association area, and this is considered the most complicated part of the cortex because it has really interesting and very complex and diverse functions in it. And I actually already talked about this in part one of this, the part one video. Remember when I was talking about functions of the frontal lobe? What I was really talking about was this area, this specific area of the frontal lobe called the anterior association area. You should also know that this is referred to as the prefrontal cortex. And again, this is the part dealing with personality, with behavioral inhibition. Remember that slide? All right, go back and look at that because, again, all those functions are associated with this area. I've already talked about it. Things like making proper judgments, making proper decisions, the ability to use logic and reason, putting abstract ideas together to be able to do things like plan things, right? Okay, so yeah. Now, the development, this is really interesting because I know I talked to you all about the example of hardcore criminals and how they have smaller frontal lobes. Well, really specifically, it's this area that's smaller. And I do remember mentioning, like, well, what's the deal with it? Why is it smaller? Well, think about this. You know, a lot of people who have committed really serious crimes, and you know, they've been psychoanalyzed and everything. And you know, what do so many of them talk about? They talk about problems in childhood. They talk about abuse that they've encountered. They've you know, come from really broken families. You know, they had a very bad childhood. Okay, maybe their social environment, okay, social environment was not conducive for the proper development of this region. Okay, and so that's what's really interesting about this. One of the many things that's so interesting about this part of the brain, all right, is that its development through childhood, through adolescence, through early adulthood, the development, okay, of this brain region is very much dependent on social feedback. Okay, what is that person's social environment like? All right, if a person is locked up in a room for years, they're not going to have feedback from social environment. They're not going to have feedback. They're not going to have a lot of this. They're not going to have a very well developed ability to do reasoning and to make proper judgments and have abstract thinking and plan out the right things to do and know how to control their behavior because they have not had enough feedback from their social environment. You have to have social interaction, okay, in order to know what to do, to understand society norms, to understand what's proper on behavior, right? I mean, that makes sense. Okay, this is why you know, humans are very social animals. You human primates, all right, and if you really study the chimpanzees, right, and gorillas, if you really study them, you know, they're so much more intelligent than other animals. And a lot of the reason for this is because they do a lot of socializing. All right. They hang out together a lot. They're grooming each other all the time, stuff like that, right? So yeah, just, you know, don't want to go off on a tangent. Major point. Social environment is going to dictate development of this part of the brain. All right, posterior association area. The only thing I want to point out about this is Wernicke's area. I already mentioned it. Don't forget, I'm probably going to have a question about that. So Wernicke's area is involved in speech comprehension. All right. All right, the limbic association area. So the limbic association area is part of a larger system called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system has a few really important regions that we definitely need to know about. It says here it involves the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. But I want you to know that the limbic system is composed of a few more really important brain regions, and we'll talk about them. All right, we'll talk about them later. For now, hippocampus is really a big deal. All right, hippocampus is associated with learning and memory. You should know that the function of the hippocampus is learning and memory. Now, also a part of this limbic system is our beloved region known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also part of the limbic system. You have other areas of the limbic system known as the amygdala. The amygdala is associated with emotion. And this will be on another slide, so don't worry. So the amygdala, which is also part of this limbic system, is associated with emotion, especially emotions like fear, feelings of aggression. All right, feeling like you want to be aggressive. You can feel aggressive, but whether or not you actually act aggressive, now, if you act aggressive, that's up to the anterior association area. That's up to the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe. Okay, but this is those emotions and like aggression and stuff like that is really going to originate in the amygdala of the limbic system. The limbic system is an extremely interesting part of the brain to study because what you see is that there is a very high level of integration between the regions in the limbic system. Okay, so hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, they all have very, very intimate relationships with each other. Very complicated networks are existing in the regions within this limbic system. So you're going to be able to attach emotions to memories, for example. You're going to be able to easily attach emotions formulated in the amygdala with new memories that you make located in the hippocampus. All right. So very, very cool and interesting relationships between the brain regions making up this limbic system. All right, this is a first part here is also more about this anterior association area, which I've mentioned already and dwelled on it probably too much. All right, but I just want to reiterate again. Now, if you have damage to this anterior association area, you're going to have personality issues, major mental issues, major personality issues. And, you know, I didn't mention it yet, so let me mention it because he's kind of a famous guy. And maybe you've learned about him in psychology. His name is Phineas Gage. Maybe some of you have heard of this guy. He's really famous. Phineas Gage. He was a guy way back, just a regular guy, way back in like the late 1800s. And he worked along a railroad. And so one day he was at work, he's walking along, and something happened. He stepped on a pipe, like a large pipe, and sort of the pipe backfired on him. It like went towards him, and it went up through the bottom of his chin. Okay, it penetrated up through the bottom of his chin, and it went through the middle of his face, and it exited out through the frontal lobe. It went right through the anterior association area. Now, pretty severe injury, right? Well, miraculously, they were able to pull this big pipe out, and he lived. He survived. Okay, and what they found, and you know what's so significant about Phineas Gage from a history of science perspective is that, well, way back in like the late 1800s, scientists didn't know very much at all about what different parts of the brain did. We really didn't have an idea at all about, hey, this brain region does this brain region does that. We didn't know. The only way you could know what a part of the brain did was if there was damage. If you knew that person before and you say, okay, this person is fine, and then they get damage to a certain part of the brain, and all of a sudden this person's acting different, right? What are they missing? What are they not doing anymore, right? What is missing from them? Then they were able to say, okay, well, that part of the brain then must be associated with this function. All right, and so this is why Phineas Gage was so important in our understanding of localization of function, being able to localize a certain function to a specific part of the brain. And he did that for us with this anterior association area, all right? So before this injury, Phineas was a really nice guy. He, had a family, children, very well-behaved guy, very well-mannered. He went to work every day. He brought home the bacon, and he was a good husband, and a good man. Had a lot of friends. Good guy. Well, after the injury, he was the opposite of all of that. After that, he could not. He was not able to control his behavior. All right. So he could not. Also, he could not censor his thoughts. So he would just say whatever he was thinking. He was cursing up a storm, just every other word was a bad word, and he turned mean. It was like, you know, you found out who he really didn't like because he was telling them, all right? You know, it just all came out. He wasn't able to do censorship. So his personality changed altogether. He was not able to inhibit his behavior. He wasn't able to inhibit his thoughts. He became very irresponsible. He didn't work anymore. He didn't want to, you know, take care of his family anymore. I mean, he just totally changed. All right, so looks like my computer's wanting to cut me off. Maybe that's a sign. Okay. All right, there you go. So Phineas was oblivious to social restraints, and this would be the case for anyone with damage to this part. They're more likely to take risk, again, because they're not, they don't have any idea of social constraints and morals at that point. All right, so that's the anterior association area. Now, what if you have damage to the posterior association area? This is going to be very interesting. So remember that the posterior association areas are dealing with sensory, all right? It's dealing with sensation. Things like proprioception, so like understanding where you are in space. Now, if you have a posterior association area damaged, you're not able to integrate certain aspects or certain modalities of sensation and awareness. Okay, remember, proprioceptors deal with, you know, awareness of where you are in space. Now, if you have damage to the posterior association area, a person, for example, will know that they have a right arm. They know that let me re-say it. They're going to actually, let's say a person has this posterior association area lesion. It's like they don't realize that they have a right arm, or they don't realize that they have a left arm. It's like they can see it, but they don't understand that it belongs to them. Oh, it's so interesting. People with this, it's rare, okay? But people with damage to this area, so they're such interesting people, because, yeah, they'll be like, no, I'm not dealing with that. I'm not dealing with that right arm. It's not mine. And they refuse to deal with it. Not, I don't mean to laugh at it, but it's really interesting. All right. Again, they're not able to integrate. They're not able to put it together. They're not able to comprehend that, hey, yeah, that's my right arm, and I should be like cleaning it and stuff. All right, a little bit here about lateralization. I don't want to go too much into this because, you know, I don't really think it's a big deal. But you know, just in general, lateralization. What we're saying is that, yeah, the hemispheres are not identical. All right, the right hemisphere has different functions compared to the left hemisphere. You know, certain parts of the certain regions are only found on the left versus the right. For example, Broca's area, you know, is pretty much only on the left. All right. You know, I'm not going to ask you any details about lateralization beyond that. Now, one side of the brain is going to be larger than the other side. Now, most humans, 90% of humans, are left brain dominant. Okay, that means the left side of their brain is a little bit larger than the right side. And so what does that tell you? If they're left side dominant, are they going to be left-handed or right-handed? Okay, if a person is left side dominant, that means they're right-handed. Because remember, we have contralateral control. So if the left side of the brain is larger, that person is going to be more adept and skilled at using the right side of the body. A little bit more here about lateralization. Left hemisphere has certain functions. Right hemisphere has other functions. Left hemisphere in general, we're dealing a lot with language. Okay, remember we have our Broca's area and Wernicke's area there. Okay, so things like logic and the ability to use math and science are are going to be over there. A lot of people call the left side the scientific side. And the right side, we're dealing with, a lot of people call the right side the artistic side or the creative side. We're dealing with imagination, musical and artistic skill, and that kind of stuff. Now, here's a illustration that is, going through a list here of what the left side does and what the right side does. Guess what? I'm not going to ask you anything about that. If you want to know that, that's up to you. All right. You know what? Let me see if I want to go any further here, because I think we're really getting into, yeah, let me go ahead and talk about the striatum, and then we'll stop there. Okay, we are done with cortex. All right, we're done with cortex. So we're going to go into a deeper part of the brain here. And it's referred to as the basal nuclei, okay, also known as the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is actually a collection of regions. Now, I do want you to know what regions make up this basal ganglia. We have the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Now, together, okay, the caudate nucleus and the putamen together, if you're referring to those two together, you can actually call that by a different name known as striatum. Okay, so striatum. And typically that is what's done. Okay, so the striatum is made up of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. Now, the striatum is very closely associated with another very important part of the brain called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. And it makes melanin. Okay, we have melanin up there. So this part of the brain, you can actually see, like if you're dissecting the brain, it's darker, all right? It has a dark color to it because there's pigment in there, melanin. Okay, now what's important about this substantia nigra? Well, we're dealing with motor function here, and this is going to come into play again when we talk about Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. All right, so the substantia nigra is a motor center, okay, that is associated with, and it really is complicated actually. I'm trying to keep it simple here, but the substantia nigra is going to relay inhibitory signals, okay, to the basal ganglia as well as the thalamus to prevent unwanted movements. Okay, so you should understand that the substantia nigra, which is outside of the basal ganglia, okay, it's not part of the basal ganglia, but it's close to it. So the substantia nigra is going to inhibit unnecessary movements or unwanted movements. And it does this by giving inhibitory signals to the basal ganglia as well as the thalamus. Now, what happens in Parkinson's disease is that the substantia nigra becomes degenerated. All right, so you're having a breakdown of this region called the substantia nigra. And so because we are having a breakdown in this tissue, what happens is we're not able to inhibit unwanted movements, are we? All right, we can no longer inhibit unnecessary movements. And so this is why we see tremors in Parkinson's disease. And, I'm going to detail that out even more when we talk about Parkinson's specifically. But for now, you should know Parkinson's disease is caused by a degeneration of the substantia nigra, all right? And this is why we're going to see tremors, okay? Because we're not able to filter out unwanted movements. We're not able to filter out unnecessary movements because the substantia nigra is degenerated. What you should also know are the neurotransmitters that regulate this. Okay, dopamine and glutamate. Dopamine and glutamate are involved. Now, there is a lot of feedback between dopamine and glutamate when we're dealing with all of these regions. And we're not going to go into the details of that. Okay, right now, all you need to know is that dopamine and glutamate are associated with this. Now, the thing is, you remember dopamine, we talked about it. Now, dopamine can be excitatory or it can be inhibitory. So what the deal is that substantia nigra releases dopamine onto the striatum, and that is what is going to inhibit unwanted movements. Now, dopamine in this case plays an inhibitory role. Okay, so dopamine will be released from the substantia nigra and will inhibit, okay, the certain neurons of the striatum. Okay, so dopamine plays an inhibitory role in this case. Glutamate is always excitatory. Okay, now, there's a very intricate interplay between the inhibitory role of dopamine in this part of the brain and the excitatory role of glutamate. They are going to be talking all the time, basically. There's a lot of intricate feedback between the two, inhibitory, excitatory, that are working to inhibit unwanted movements and activate others. Activate due to glutamate. Okay, so main idea on this. All right, you've got your basal ganglia made of these three parts. The striatum is made of caudate nucleus and putamen, and really a lot of action is associated with the striatum. Closely associated with the substantia nigra, which is going to release dopamine onto the striatum to inhibit unwanted body movements. Parkinson's disease, we have a degeneration of substantia nigra. Parkinson's disease, if we have degeneration of substantia nigra, we're not having dopamine release onto striatum, so we're not having the inhibition of unwanted body movements. This leads to tremors. Okay, now as far as functions, right, functions of this basal ganglia are really all about stereotyped movements. All right, stereotyped movements that, that you've done before, okay? Stored in your memory, they're just repetitious movements. And again, that's why, what you're going to see in tremors, Parkinson's disease, are typically going to be tremors associated with like stereotyped movements. And again, the basal ganglia is dealing with the filtering out of incorrect motor behavior and the filtering out of inappropriate motor responses. Okay, and again, we'll bring up Parkinson's and Huntington's disease again. Huntington's I did not mention there, all right, because we'll talk about later. All right, here's just the anatomy here of the striatum. Okay, so you have the part of the basal ganglia is the striatum. You have the caudate nucleus and the putamen. The putamen is like this little circular part here. The caudate is this like horn type structure. It kind of looks like the lateral ventricle, all right? It looks very much like the lateral ventricle, but lateral ventricle is going to be up higher, okay? So, but we're talking about here in the middle of the brain. The caudate, okay, you have a caudate nucleus, which is the anterior here. You have the tail of the caudate down here. It looks like a tail. And then you have the putamen. Now, just here behind this putamen in this other purple color, you can see that the thalamus is there. So thalamus is going to be related here as well, just due to close proximity. Here's a transverse view of all this. Again, you're not going to be asked to recognize any of it, but if you want to see a transverse view, this whole area, but you can see how large this area is. All right, pretty important part of the brain. Okay, so yeah, all of this. But yeah, you can see, so the caudate right here is in blue. The anterior part of it is up here. And then the back of it, okay, the tail is going to actually be back here, okay? And I think these lines are not accurate. Right, but again, your ventricles are here. Now, thalamus is there. You have your putamen. There is this other part of the basal ganglia called the globus pallidus, which is sort of this more medial pink structure here. Here's another way you can look at it, a coronal view, if you're interested. I think we're good. Yeah, let's stop there. That was enough. And I will be making a third video on this chapter as soon as possible. Have a great day.